Alrighty, so we are going to talk about different types of economic systems and some reforms after the Industrial Revolution. Because with the Industrial Revolution, we're seeing that the way that we do business is changing. We're going from a cottage industry to a factory system. And so obviously the way that we conduct business now at this point in history is going to be different. So we're going to talk about different types of economic systems and economic theories. And obviously different countries have different ideas about how the economy should be run. Should the government intervene? Should the government have power over economic practice, etc.? Should they not? So we're going to look at a couple of those things. So before we get into that, let's talk about the factors of production. You guys need to know what the factors of production are. So now that we're in a factory system, basically there's three things that you need to have a factory system: to industrialize, to produce goods. You need land, labor, and capital. So I would, if I were you, highlight these three things. So land is obviously raw materials, areas that are natural and they produce resources. Labor, you need people to do the jobs, right? And capital, you need human-made goods to produce more goods. So basically like technology to produce goods at a faster rate. So for example, like the factory system itself, right, with the technology of like the steam engine, that would be an example of capital. All right. So our first economic system that we are going to look at is capitalism. This is probably one that you're familiar with. We've talked about it before. But capitalism, like we previously discussed, is an economic system that is based on individual ownership and control of the factors of production, and also private ownership of property, private ownership of wealth and business. So capitalism is all based on kind of like the private ownership of business and property. Okay, so that's kind of an easy way to remember it: private ownership. So this belief that individuals, not the government, so capitalism excludes the government's right or excludes the government from running any type of economic practice or overseeing the economy. So capitalists tend to believe that the government should take a back seat and individuals deserve to own and kind of control and run the economy and the factors of production. All right, so a couple of capitalist philosophers that we are going to talk about, are economic philosophers. So the first is Adam Smith. You probably want to highlight his name. You do need to know who he is. So he wrote this book called The Wealth of Nations. And in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith comes up with this concept, this theory of laissez-faire. So I would highlight laissez-faire here. And laissez-faire literally means to let the people do as they want. The government takes a hands-off approach and does not interfere with the economy or economic growth. Okay, so you'll see that it's unregulated by the government. So meaning like the government can't intervene here. Okay, so it's all about individual ownership. And he also argued that capitalism is successful because it is based on and functions around these three natural laws. So you do need to know the natural laws, and you might want to add in some information. So the first is self-interest. Okay, so self-interest in this case means that people are basically going to work for their own good. People will work harder if they know they're going to make more money. And depending on, they'll put in more hours because they're working for the benefit of themselves. So self-interest, people will work harder for their own good. So if it's going to benefit them in a positive way, they're most likely going to put in more work. The second is competition. That with capitalism, competition forces people to create a better product. So competing businesses will continue to compete to produce a better product because you want to sell the most products, right? You want to have more people purchasing your product than your competitors. So think of it like Adidas and Nike, right? They're constantly competing to produce a better shoe. And so there are similar types of shoes that maybe they produce, but each one offers something different. And so that competition is what keeps them in business and also forces them to create a better product at a lower price. Okay, and the last is supply and demand. So basically, there needs to be enough goods, again, produced at a low price to meet the demand of people. People have to be able to afford it, but it also has to be a quality item. Okay. The benefits of capitalism, according to Adam Smith, is that the competition creates quality goods at a lower price, like we just discussed, right? And there's a constant search for new technologies to produce these better items and also produce them quicker, right? Faster profit. So two other capitalists are Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo. Thomas Malthus believed that the population grew faster than basically the food supply could actually support. And in his opinion, this was necessary because obviously we cannot support everyone. And so basically we're keeping the population under control by way of wars, epidemics, kind of keep the poor classes under control. And it was kind of a necessary evil. So a lot of these capitalist philosophers, these economic philosophers that we're talking about right now, aren't really advocating for efforts to help the poor working class. David Ricardo said that there's always going to be a permanent underclass, right? And basically that the lower class, again, was always going to be poor. There's a permanent lower class. The lower class is always going to be poor. And basically that if the population was that high, wages need to be kept low, right? And this is necessary to the for the economy to function well. All right, socialism. This is your next economic theory. So socialism is a little bit different, and you probably have this idea that socialism is a bad idea. That's because in America, right, we tend to kind of lean towards capitalism. But what socialist means that people basically share. So when you're trying to remember what socialism is, think socialist like this idea of sharing, meaning that the means of production, the factors of production, right, land, labor, capital, is all controlled and shared by the people as a whole. Okay, so it's also the belief that the government should have some economic power because the government should intervene to basically improve people's lives. So workers should also, in that case, then receive, wages that are equal to the work that they're putting in. And basically both the state and the workers should benefit from this practice, right? If they're kind of taking care of each other. If the government takes care of the people, right, the people will work hard enough and the economy will flourish. That's kind of what that means by both the state and the workers should profit. Okay, and it's based on these two ideas of utilitarianism and utopianism. So utilitarianism basically is that the government should create laws that's going to create the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? If a government doesn't do this, according to a socialist or to socialist theory, it's useless. Okay, so the government's only useful if it promotes the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. And basically this idea of utopianism that people should basically improve the conditions because the conditions for the working class is so poor. So factory owners should really work to meet the needs of their employees. Okay, so that's socialism. Let's talk about Karl Marx because you probably know a little bit about Karl Marx as well. He doesn't actually come up with this idea of socialism, but more so communism. So let's talk about who he is first, and kind of then we'll talk about where his ideas come from. So he had some issues with capitalism. He didn't like the fact that the wealthy or the top 1% really controlled a lot of the factors of production. He felt like that was unfair. And he noticed that obviously the poor or the poorer working classes are supporting the higher social classes. And so he wrote the Communist Manifesto with Friedrich Engels. So you don't really need to focus on Engels as much, but we'll more so talk about Marxism. But in their book, they wrote about, the world's kind of divided into two groups of people, the haves and the have-nots, right? So the rich and the poor. You might also see it, or again, between the rich and the poor, and that the gap between the rich and the poor is very large. And so his goal is, again, to kind of close the gap, make people equal. So the haves being the bourgeoisie, so the higher social classes, and the have-nots being the proletariat. And so that's kind of like what his beliefs, kind of about capitalist economies and the world are based on. So with communism, this is a more radical form of socialism. Okay, so you're probably familiar with it, right? Communism, especially from an American perspective, has a negative connotation. But again, it's a more radical form of socialism. So we said that socialism talks about sharing kind of the factors of production, but with communism, it goes a step further. Okay, so I said that basically the world is divided into the haves and the have-nots, according to Marx. So according to communism, his theory, the proletariat, they're the working class. So you need to know this word, I would highlight it. Proletariat means working class, would one day overthrow these higher social classes, the bourgeoisie, because of the poor working conditions and the hesitance to actually improve their conditions. And eventually, when the working class does that, all means of production are going to be shared and owned by the people. There is no such thing as ownership of private property. The workers are going to control the government, and eventually it would form a classless society, again, where everyone's considered equal, and no private property. Okay, so the problem with communism is that it doesn't actually work in practice. And the gap between the rich and the poor that Marx was referring to doesn't necessarily widen as much as Marx predicted. So, and that's due to reforms that are made to improve the lives and the working conditions for the working class. So this is why you don't see this as a popular form of government, because really in practice, it doesn't work. And the way that people try to implement communism, again, doesn't always follow this working class overthrowing the capitalist. So some of the reforms that take place, remember I said communism doesn't really work in practice because a lot of reforms that take place. So a lot of capitalist economies or capitalist countries are going to create unions. So because of the poor working conditions, right, they are going to create unions, which basically are groups of people who are advocating for the good of the working class or the good of the worker. So trying to improve their working conditions. And these unions lead to, again, several different reforms. So in the UK, we saw, and the US, there's limited work hours, right? For certain jobs, you can only work a certain number of work hours a week, or you should. And there are laws against child labor, right? You can't hire a child to do labor. We also see the abolition of slavery. So that's going to be a practice that is, again, abolished. We went over that with the Enlightenment and also the women's rights movement. So this called for better pay for women, better and safer conditions, because at this time, before we have these reforms, not just for women, but for anyone, there is no protection in the workplace. So if you are injured on the job, that is going to be something that could possibly lose you your job, and there is no protection, no compensation for you until certain reforms are actually put in place to protect the worker, thanks to unions, thanks to new laws being passed, and also the promotion of education for workers and for females as well. So these reforms, again, are going to be what kind of keeps capitalism afloat, and it also prevents communism from really taking place and it being effective, is what I'm trying to say. All right, so those are the end of these notes. I'm going to do a reading on different economic practices.